does it seem at all plausible to me that there could be something, even in like our nearly empirical reality, that humans have just like systematically missed for our entire history?
I'm here with Dr. Jim Madden. You're a professor of philosophy who has dared to reconcile some ancient philosophy with UFOs. I think a lot of people, have heard of Plato's Republic or the cave analogy or, the myth of but they don't really have a ton of context as to who Plato was, why he did what he did.
I think you have to get away from thinking what we're being proposed here is actually Plato's like political program. And there's something else going on here.
If there's a push and a pull outside of the cave or whatever, is the UFO some sort of pulling technology? Because you talk about this where it's this thing that it busts all of your priors.
Yeah, it would seem there has to be somebody outside of the cave doing this. Like somebody has to, from the perspective of enlightenment, be pulling us through.
The light itself also feels like this kind of, it's like an inflection point.
Yes.
Where it could either sort of eviscerate us or it could kind of save us. It's like, does something super unprecedented happen when we discover, the myth makers? When we develop the perceptive apparatuses through high energy output or through some sort of ascended consciousness to like see who's like messing with us.
Yeah.
And does that just unravel reality? I'm here with Dr. Jim Madden, and it's an absolute honor to have you. I've been kind of mulling over the ideas in your book for a while now. You're a professor of philosophy who has dared to reconcile some ancient philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, even up until today, more modern, Nietzsche, Heidegger, with UFOs. And I think that is a very noble effort, and you've done it in a very brilliant way in this great book, Unidentified Flying Hyperobject, which I recommend everybody go out and read. And so I want to start kind of at a super baseline level, because I think a lot of people, have heard of Plato's Republic or the cave analogy or, the myth of but they don't really have a ton of context as to who Plato was, why he did what he did. So why don't we just start at kind of ground zero? Who is Plato and why did he write the Republic?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I think the only thing that's really surprised me, I should say what surprised me the most about this whole process of getting the UFO and bringing philosophy into it is that no one had done it before in this way. So that was surprising to me. But okay, so who is Plato? So obviously, probably most people know Plato was the student of Socrates. And in most of Plato's dialogues, which is most of what we have of his writings, Socrates is the main character, though not in all of them. And it's pretty clear that Socrates does not always speak for Plato, which I think is important even in the Republic. Other than that, Plato was an aristocratic, member of Athenian society, in the period kind of coming out of the Peloponnesian War. It's a time of like great political strife, so Socrates himself was a victim of capital punishment that had a lot to do with the politics going on in Athens at the time. Okay. Plato is not probably his given birth name, right? It's a nickname like Broad or Big, as in like broad shouldered, because he was the most accomplished wrestler of his generation, apparently.
Wow.
In Athens. Yeah. And, there's
So you're maintaining that tradition today.
I'm doing my best.
I'm
doing my best.
Jiu-jitsu master.
Yeah. So I think an important thing to note about the Republic is, the setting of it is in kind of a small. This is anachronistic, like a suburb of Athens. It's not actually in the city, so it's outside the city. So it's a book about cities that's not in a city, which is interesting. And we know about when Plato is setting it because it begins by referring to a certain religious festival that classical scholars can date when that festival likely happened. So we know it's set at a time when Plato would have been like a little kid. Okay, so he obviously was not there, right? So probably these conversations didn't happen, right? But the characters are obviously Socrates And two other characters are Glaucon and Adeimantus, who were Plato's half-brothers. And there's another character, Thrasymachus, who's sort of a foil to those three in the dialogue. And I'm not sure if I'm getting this exactly right, but my understanding is none of those people are alive by the time Plato writes this, and none of them died natural deaths. Okay, so they're actually on separate sides of this struggle. Okay, so like Thrasymachus, my understanding, was on the other side of this post-Peloponnesian War political struggle from Plato's family. Okay, so it's interesting. What Plato's depicting for us is this moment where everybody was kind of together, behaving civilly for the last time. Okay, and then it's all going to fall apart politically after that. Okay, which I think is important for how we understand this book and whether or not it's like proposing to us an optimistic or pessimistic view of things, right? Okay. So the dialogue then begins with Socrates and the guys are here for this religious festival, and they're invited to a party. And there's going to be torch races, and it's going to be a big deal. And there's an older guy there who they're kidding him about being old, and isn't it terrible getting old? And he's like, well, no, because I don't have to worry about all the pressures for sex and all this stuff anymore. And they're like, yeah, but you're going to die soon. And he said, well, I'm not worried about death because I've lived a just life, and the just don't have to fear their death. Okay. And when asked, well, what do you mean by justice? He leaves the scene. Okay. So it's interesting. The authority figure, the old man, is making claims, but he can't cash it. Okay. And this goes on in all the Platonic dialogues, is the authority figures always fail to actually deliver what they're claiming. Okay. But I think it's interesting that Plato's Republic, the actual question that initiates the dialogue is the question of death. Okay. Which then occasions the question of justice. Okay. So I think we think of the dialogue, if we've read it, is being a question about what is justice, but that's the secondary question. Like that's something we're answering to address the question of death. And do note that the book ends with a myth about death. Okay. So it's bookended, as it were, with life and death. Okay. Or with two stories about death. So for my money, if you ask me what's the Republic about, it's really about death. Okay. And the human condition in facing death. All right. Okay. So at that point, then, what is justice? Gets raised, and now philosophy breaks out. Okay. And there's a really vehement debate between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Eventually Thrasymachus has had enough and leaves. And then Adeimantus and Glaucon take up his position, as like devil advocates. And, they debate with Socrates what justice is. They decide that deciding what justice is for we as human individuals, right, is too difficult. So they switch it to a political story. Okay. So what would justice be in the city? All right. But always with the idea that, once again, like we're trying to find out what would it be just as individuals, so we can then figure out whether or not we have anything to fear in death. It's always the background. So there's like three layers going on in the book. And maybe the most important one is the one that's mentioned the least. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, because it's, I feel like it's thought of as this, what is the ideal state, especially vis-a-vis maybe, Socrates' death, where, Athens as a democracy sort of turns on him. He ends up drinking the hemlock. And then it's like, okay, if that doesn't work, how can we, in some sort of peripatetic way, figure out through dialogue what the ideal state is? But you're saying that it actually maybe has more to just do with death and like this really important metaphysical question of what happens when you die.
Now, once this is probably controversial. And of course, everything in academic philosophy is controversial, right? So you could find brighter people than I am who agree with me, and you could find brighter people than I am who would disagree with me. That's always a problem. Yeah,
I agree. I also think we are probably over-indexed on taking everything allegorically and not literally. Yeah. And so I'm more sympathetic to the Plato literalists. Yeah. But that's my own. Totally. I'm allowed to do that because I'm a dilettante.
Yeah. I envy you being dilettante. Okay, so and I think there's very interesting things that go on in the book. So basically, we're told the only just state would be one that had a philosopher as a ruler, right? So ultimately, the famous philosopher king. Okay, but it also, like Plato says early on, that any state that occurs naturally is going to fall apart due to greed and injustice and this. Okay, so if you think of like any natural city is not run by a philosopher. Okay. And we get a story of how you would cultivate philosophers sufficient to run a city. But no, you'd have to have a good city first to have those, to produce those philosophers in the first place. So there's this really difficult circular problem of founding in the Republic. Like, how could you ever get a just city? Because it would have to be built by a philosopher, right? But a philosopher would have to be produced by a just city.
Just end up in this sort of tautological loop or something.
Yeah, you end up in a loop. Okay, so I think I mentioned that because I think you have to get away from thinking what we're being proposed here is actually Plato's like political program, and there's something else going on here, right? There's also an important moment where it's after the allegory of the cave, and the question comes up like, would the philosopher have to return to the cave after leaving? And of course, in the allegory, the philosopher does go back and annoys people because he's asking them to change their lives and things like that. And eventually it ends very, very badly for him. And it's a not so thinned reference to Socrates. Okay. And interesting what Plato has Socrates say when he's asked, would we have to make the philosopher go back? He says, well, in our city, meaning the ideal city that we're thinking of, the philosopher would owe his education to the city, and thereby he should return. Okay. But think of it. That's only the ideal city. And Plato has said throughout the book that the ideal city is not going to happen here. Right. So it seemed like he's saying like in any actual concrete, like human political situation, the philosopher really should not return. It would be a futile effort. Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And so just what is the cave at a baseline for the average person?
Sure. Okay. So at a certain point in the dialogue, the question of how we would educate a philosopher comes up. Okay. And basically the cave is Plato's way of explaining what the education of the philosopher would be like. Okay. So I think that's important to see, like that's where it's proposed. Okay. And in the analogy or allegory that he uses to make the point is he says, so we have a bunch of people, they're in a cave, they're chained so they can only look forward, and all they see are images dancing on the cave wall. Okay. And then at some point, and I think if that were the case, no one could possibly know the difference, right? There's no ability to separate yourself from this, right? So it would be what we would call today a consensus reality.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And now Plato never explains this, but voila, somebody gets loose. Okay. It's interesting. We never get an explanation of how that initial liberation would happen. Okay. And that person is able to turn and look away. It's a very important thing that Plato emphasizes, is that person looks away from the wall and can see back and see that what's really going on is there's a wall behind them, and there's people behind it with puppets on sticks, and there's a fire casting light onto the wall, right? So what the people see on the wall is not entirely wrong, right? The shadows are right-ish, but they're not fully right. Okay. And so this newly liberated person sees that, right? And then goes through a process of maybe even literally clawing his way out of the cave. It's a difficult, arduous process, right? And what he's moving towards is towards a sort of light, right? Okay. So the fire initially that he saw, that was part of the put on, that's a kind of light. It's enlightenment. It's a sign of knowledge, right? But it's not full knowledge. And think of it for the Greeks, we would even say something like this: all energy, all heat, all fire on the earth is ultimately derived from the sun, right? Okay. So he's looking for the source of that fire, right? And he crawls his way out of the cave and eventually, can get out, and it's very difficult. So he has to leave and come back a little bit. It's very difficult to get out of the cave and see in the light for the first time. And eventually he works his way up to glimpsing the sun. Okay. Glimpsing what Plato elsewhere calls the good, right? But he can only glimpse it, right? And so then he returns to the cave, and of course, in returning to the cave, the light has changed again, and he stumbles around as if he's blind. So he looks like a fool, right? He presses people that there's more to the world. What you're seeing is an illusion, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, famously, it ends badly for him, just as it ended for Socrates very badly. Yeah.
And there seems to be sort of push and pull. Like this person is ascending out of the cave on their own sort of volition, but they're also being sort of dragged. Is that right?
Or because you think of it like throughout the book, it's clear for Plato, enlightenment doesn't just happen. You have to be taught. Right? Like really, you could make a case. The book is a philosophy of education, right? It's what should our ruling elite be like? Like, how should they be educated, right? And the one thing Plato would say is you cannot just let nature take its course this way, right? Like, people are not disposed to take themselves out of illusion, right? They're disposed to stay in illusion, right? So someone has to be pulling, right? Yeah.
So
which is a problem, I think, for the book. Yeah.
Is the implication that the guardians or the puppeteers, are they outside of the cave, or are they in the cave, or where do they sort of exist spatially in this analogy? Hey, American Alchemy fans, after years of trying pretty much every shaving product under the sun, I finally found something that I love. It's called House of Atlas. I use it every day. House of Atlas's razor kit has raised my grooming game in the biggest way. The razor leaves you with the smoothest shave you'll ever get. They have precision shave cream, calming aftershave. Seriously, I don't know what they're doing with this blade, but it leaves my skin feeling silky smooth. With its 5 US-made stainless steel blades and that high-performance serum strip, it glides through my facial hair for an incredibly close, comfortable shave. They also have one of the most luxurious feeling and precision guiding shave creams and a very calming aftershave. Their shave cream has a thick, rich, special formula that gives me a clear guide for an even shave, and the aftershave leaves my skin feeling cool and refreshed without any of that old school sting that you might get from other products. Plus, and this might be the coolest thing of all, the kit comes with an epic magnetic storage hook. And now, for a limited time, they're offering 15% off your first order when you purchase any razor kit in the before and after set. This includes the precision shave cream and calming aftershave. Use code Jesse, Jesse, at houseofatlas.com. That's HOUSEOFATLAS.com with promo code Jesse, Jesse, for 15% off your new razor kit and before and after set. So stop wasting money and time on shaving products that don't look good, aren't effective, and cost way too much. Visit houseofatlas.com today. Trust me, you'll love it as much as I do.
Let me give you a spooky answer to that.
Yeah,
okay, all right.
Cool.
So at a certain point in the Republic, Plato has Socrates and the fellows arrive at this conclusion that the guardians will have to be told, in some translations, good lies about the afterlife. Okay. Meaning, like, they have to be told stories that will like let them see that there's going to be a reward for a certain type of behavior that's like the best for the state, right? Okay. And the book ends with a myth about the afterlife. Okay. So what do we get? We get a good lie about the afterlife. Okay. Now, my read on that is what Plato's doing is he's saying, look, I just dragged you through the same educative process that I was outlined in the book. Right. Do you see what I mean? So, like, it's like, it would seem there has to be somebody outside of the cave doing this. Like, somebody has to, from the perspective of enlightenment, be pulling us through. Do you see that?
Yeah.
The whole book, I think, tricks you into following that very process.
And the guardians themselves are told a lie, and then they sort of purvey the lie as well. Yeah. They transmit the lie. That's fascinating.
In their training, he says they would have to be told. It's some translations call it a good myth. Some translate. I like this because I'm a contrarian. Call it a good lie.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, everyone has to be lied to in this process. Yeah.
And the guardians, the implication there is they're guardians of this ideal city state. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Okay. And then do we have any understanding of who is telling them this sort of noble mythology?
Yeah. And keep in mind, like this is a problem because Plato earlier said any natural city is going to fall apart because of natural human greed and selfishness and such. Right. So how you could ever get this off the ground doesn't seem to be within like a legitimate human possibility for Plato.
So there are all these ways you could take this. You could take this as a total like myth or whatever. And I think the festival, right, that this was sort of told at was a festival of myth. Is that right?
Well, it was certainly a Greek, religious festival, right? So yeah. Exactly.
And then there's so that's like on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it's like this is all true. This is like a descriptor of ontological truth and reality. And I guess where do you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I don't. So the way I like to put it is, I don't think Plato was a Platonist. Okay, what I mean is the kind of philosophy 101 that we all teach our students, because you have to we have to tell some good myths to get things going. Be careful there, but okay. Is very much a caricature of Plato. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, but I also think there's something, so I do think there's a lot of put on going on in the book. I think we're being toyed with in certain ways.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it's a kind of a test. Like, do you get it?
Yeah.
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 Okay. But I also think he's perfectly serious about some of the things in that book.
Right.
Okay. So for instance, at the end, the concluding myth, the myth of I don't take that as a serious speculation on his part of what the afterlife is like or something like that. Okay. And it's interesting because at the end of the myth, this is getting in the weeds, but people can go read the book. But at the end of the myth, goes back to temporal life, but unlike everyone else, he's granted memory of where he's been. Okay. And Plato, throughout his writings, has Socrates defend the notion that all knowledge is actually recollection of something that we already had. Okay. And so I think what you're getting here then is this suggestion that like our relationship to the ultimate truth is going to be more like memory than it is something like a direct discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he says to kind of distrust your like five senses, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like this primordial knowledge is more true in a sense. And so totally, because you could say that, it's all mythology or whatever when it comes to him even saying that. But then in the book of Meno, they literally have this slave draw a triangle, and the slave is, completely uneducated. And that's sort of proof that there is this kind of primordial architecture and knowledge. And I believe also in the symposium, it was, a knowledge of geometry was somehow not only emphasized, but almost like a litmus test for like admission.
Like, so we could teach anybody this if we just reminded them the right way. Or like something that Plato does in the Phaedo, or he has Socrates say in the Phaedo, which interestingly, Plato goes out of his way to say he wasn't there for the conversation of Phaedo. So he oddly distances himself from it, which is interesting. But he, the example is like, you have a lover who played the harp. Now the harp doesn't resemble them at all, but the harp will remind you of them. Okay. So like, I think what Plato's getting at is there are things that we encounter in this life that are utterly unlike the ultimate truth, but then still manage to remind us of it.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, like the light itself also feels like this kind of, dual meaning. They're not dual meaning, but it's like an inflection point where it could either sort of eviscerate us or it could kind of save us.
Yeah.
And I think about technology now, and it has that sort of, dual kind of an inflecting, mechanism where AI, for example, I love the Marshall McLuhan quote, every media extension of man is an amputation. We are sort of outsourcing our agency to a lot of these, technologies that are kind of parasitizing us, especially after the advent of information technology. It used to be kind of augmenting us, and now it's sort of outsourcing, our abilities. And then at the same time, the ability to wake up with information technology. If you're trying to learn about like UFOs or like uncover all sorts of kind of real conspiracies or issues with the way that, the indoctrinated history has been told or whatever, you can now do that because you have the access to all of the information kind of at your fingertips. Right. So enlightenment is also closer than ever.
Yeah. But there's like that two-edged sword. Like the very thing, like you and I, no internet, Jim and Jesse never meet. Right?
True.
Jesse never reads Jim's book. Jim never like gets enlightened by your podcast, right? Yeah.
Totally.
But at the same time, as like I think we're also being simultaneously undone by that very same medium.
It's fascinating. And so if you extrapolate that out into the future, there are like two possibility like if you have a Schrodinger's cat of, possibility states of, mankind, there's probably a whole wave function. But like on the one hand, you have this like enlightened city state where, you have people like Jim, Jesse, but a bunch of other people talking about virtue and like how to live a good life. And, we have like access to like nuclear fusion over unity or whatever. Like it's all great. Right. And then on the other hand, it's like a nuclear holocaust and like,
exactly.
And so if that future has somehow already arrived in some paradigm outside the cave, then I wonder if the cave itself is actually a test.
Yeah.
Like it's because there are tests to become a guardian, right?
Yeah.
And like that wouldn't be disputed, right? So is the cave itself some sort of like low level epistemic, like VR headset where it's like, you have to contemplate virtue in the right way, lead a good life. And if you don't, you're not going to make it out.
And if you do, you level up or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, think of it. And once again, like getting way over my pay grade as a classicist, right? Okay. But Plato, I mean, there were such things as prose treatise as a literary genre at the time. Okay. But yet Plato writes in dialogue. Like, right. Okay. Now we know Aristotle did, but we lost all those dialogues, but like Plato writes in dialogue. So why write in dialogue? Like, why are you doing that? And it seems like, because it lets you play more and it becomes this kind of like, okay, who's really paying attention? Right? Like who's really understanding what the narrative is doing here? Totally.
And there's something about, I love the word peripatetic, like the walking and talking and the dialogue based learning where it's like a caterpillar into a butterfly, or like you need the struggle in order to you can't circumvent the process in order to. Truth is not like a file you're given. You need to kind of engage.
And can I circle back to the light metaphor?
Yes.
Okay. So I think it's important to note in the Republic. Okay, and we could get interesting things with this with later philosophy too. But Plato talks, like he uses the sun as this metaphor. And of course, it's all, like the sun's a pretty going metaphor already. So like you have the Icarus myth, where if you want the knowledge of the gods and you fly too close, you're going to crash, right? So think of it like by Plato suggesting that we could glimpse the sun. This is very transgressive stuff for the time, right?
Yep.
But he says that the thing with the sun is it's the source of the light by which we see everything else. Okay. So then there's a question like, how could you see the sun? Do you see, it's sort of like it's, you have to take the glasses off that you look through and look at them without your glasses. Right. And so I think that's important in that for Plato, you're never going to be able to point to the good. You're never going to be able to point to ultimate being because it's the source by which anything else can be illumined to be pointed at. Right. So in any kind of like temporal empirical sense, we're always going to fall short. We're always going to fall short, always going to fall short because it's sort of the horizon against which we can judge things. It's not something in front of the horizon that we can judge. Right. So it's sort of Plato, I think, is predicting in this life perpetual failure. Right. Yeah.
It's yeah. And so, okay. I'm sure a lot of people at this point in the interview are thinking, Jesse, you have a show about UFOs.
Yeah, that's right.
What the hell does any of this have to do with UFOs? How did you even think to reconcile, people say, all philosophy is a, footnote of Plato or whatever. Like he's really the founder of Western philosophy. How did you think to reconcile that with UFOs, this sort of modern craze of objects in the sky we can't identify?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So, I think like a lot of people, I got kind of, triggered about the UFO in like 2017 when suddenly it was okay to talk about this, and then I remember I think it was 2021, I always tell the story, I was watching X-Files with my kids that summer, and it was right when the big first Pentagon press conference happened. And I'm like, so I guess Mulder was right?
I've never seen anything like it.
They've been going at it like that for almost half an hour.
There'd been this like switch, like it's suddenly they're saying, no, maybe there's something to this, which, my like basic immuno response to everything is like to study, right? And to do scholarship. So I start reading all the books and all that. And I think what connected it with Plato for me is just that metaphor of we could be really, really wrong as a consensus about what the actual nature of being is, right? I thought I was starting to see the UFO was a great, at least thought experiment about that, right? Like, does it seem at all plausible to me that there could be something even in like our nearly empirical reality, that humans have just like systematically missed for our entire history, right? And the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about things that I was already working on in philosophy of mind and cognitive science and speculative metaphysics, it seemed, oh hell yeah, it seemed like we really could be missing something that was like concretely right there all along.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even prosaically in a modern scientific context, we see, between 400 and 700 nanometers of the electromagnetic wave spectrum.
Yeah.
Our decibel range is, cut off. And so like to say that we are measurement sensors that are limited inside of a larger reality, I don't think is too controversial.
No.
And then, do UFOs somehow speak to that because they seem weakly entangled with our reality? They seem to be sort of ephemeral. Jacques Vallée, which you write about very eloquently in your book, talks about, in Passport to Magonia and others' books, a lot of past mythology involving, the denizens of Magonia, like coming down on clouds, or, all sorts of craft with wheels of Ezekiel, the blazing shields of Rome. Often it's these sort of this proto-architecture that's very true and real, and then we are sort of recollecting it through the lens of sort of modern mythology.
Right.
So yeah, what do you make of that? Hey guys, I want to tell you about my new favorite piece of apparel. These are called the Perfect Jeans. They're literally the perfect jeans. I used to wear jeans all the time, and they're kind of rough and not super stretchy or breathable. These are extremely comfortable. They work in casual environments. They work in work settings. They come in 6 different sizes from 26 inches to 50 inches, and they're all around just amazing. For a limited time, our listeners get 15% off your first order, plus free shipping at theperfectgene.nyc. Again, that's theperfectgene.nyc, or just Google The Perfect Gene. Use code Jesse15 for that 15% off. Again, that's code Jesse15. That's 15% off for new customers at theperfectgene.nyc. After purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them that we sent you. Fuck your khakis. Get the perfect gene.
One of the books that really turned me on in the UFO, and I think partly because it had a legitimizing, you have to honestly say it helped legitimize the study of it, was Carl Jung's book, UFO, a modern myth, modern myth of things in the sky. And it's interesting. Jung makes this point that it's not entirely surprising, like right after the World Wars and in the middle of, the really scary years of the Cold War, where there's this nuclear threat, that suddenly people are having a lot of anxiety, and it's being expressed in these dreams and visions of, airborne technology that may or may not be militarily threatening. And he has this, his whole account of it in terms of the mandala and like a need to return to a new wholeness, that sort of thing. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that when we're having anxiousness collectively, that it's going to express itself in the going metaphors of our era, right? Our current like unconscious obsessions, right? And for us, it's technology, right? But what I found really troubling about, and it's interesting, when you read Jung's book, it's sort of like, you get a feel when he starts out writing it, he talks about it as like a mass rumor, right? He talks, he does all the stream analysis of it. And then as the book goes on, it's like, it's getting harder for him to dismiss it though. And if you've read it, like, and at the end, he's like, and yet they're on radar.
Yeah.
And yet they leave tracks.
Yep.
And so it's like, in some, like, I'm very into psychoanalysis. Okay. And it's easy, I think, to dismiss a lot, not dismiss the wrong word, to analyze some of this stuff psychologically. And yet that's the thing that I keep coming back to is, and yet there do seem to be concrete effects. Yeah.
That was Diana Pasulka's experience as well. She's this religious studies professor at UNC Wilmington. I don't think she expected to, and she's writing about the Catholic concept of purgatory in this book, Heaven Can Wait. And then I don't think she expected to start writing about UFOs in some sort of, I think this is real sense. I think she wanted to write about it and as some modern, kind of, ephemeral religious phenomena.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the second half of that book is like she goes down the rabbit hole herself.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, I think
Yeah.
there's something extremely real here.
You can see it like in similar to Jung in like real time as Diana's writing this. She's just like the view is changing. Yeah.
It's yeah. It's like yeah, go for it. Yeah.
And so like the you know, my take on the going back to the cave metaphor, if that's okay,
Yeah.
is I subscribe to some ideas in cognitive science and philosophy of mind that would sort of like make us think that maybe the cave is not just a bug, but a feature of human cognition. Okay. And you sort of alluded to this, is that if we're faced with like a very complicated reality, right, it would seem one of the most important things that we would be able to do would be able to sort for relevance. Okay. And so, meaning like the mind may work, and I think there's some pretty good empirical stuff on this, as much by learning what to ignore as it does by learning what to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you think of it then, what are we doing? I like this metaphor. We're constantly carving a cave out. And like the stuff that we do see, it's there. Okay. I'm not an idealist. Right? So the stuff that we do see, it's there. The problem is there's always more there than it. Otherwise we couldn't cognize. Do you see that? Okay. So then though, there's gonna be this really thorny problem always of like, how do we ever tease out like what is just our carving out and leaving something behind? Okay. Or as opposed to illusion, as opposed to what's really there, et cetera, et cetera. I think once you admit that there is a irreducible human contribution to our perception of the world.
Yes.
How you ever tease those two things back out is going to be the thorniest problem possible. Yeah.
Just admitting that opens your mind to a whole host of possibilities. I love in this the three body problem, you know, in the Dark Forest trilogy, this, Chinese science fiction novel involving aliens, UFOs, it's like the farmer and the shooter, and you have, people on a 2D plane, and bullets are shot, or bullet holes are shot into that 2D plane. And to them, that could just be like, little craters, and they're playing with Flatland is another good example. It's 19th century, a book about this stuff, where to the people on the 2D plane, the holes could just be literally, they're not discretionary holes made by shooters that they can't even perceive.
Right.
And so we are inherently sort of limited by our scope of perception, and making that argument is an a priori assertion, but denying that argument is also an a priori assertion. And so you're at this kind of epistemic impasse vis-a-vis modern science, where if you propose anything like that, they just have nothing to say. And then you point towards like these ephemeral glimpses of UFOs or people who have like near-death experiences, and you say, these things are much richer than meet the eye. And then they say, oh, this is your mind plays tricks on you, blah, blah, blah. And you end up in this sort of like impossible to resolve argument.
Anaporia is like the classic. Sort of like it's a puzzle.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard that concept. That's awesome.
And one of my favorite ways of putting this, it comes from William James.
Yeah.
He has this great analogy he uses. He thinks like humans are not unlike dogs and cats running around a library, or not unlike our dogs when we're in the living room having a conversation about like the most, high level stuff, and your dog's there thinking it's like kind of hot shit, right? It's like doing the dog thing. And of course, all the sounds and smells and stuff it encounters are really there.
Yeah.
But it's a carve out from something much richer. Right?
Yes.
But he's hearing what you're saying, but it can't possibly mean anything to him because it's just not relevant to his way of being.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we think of things like cellular automata, or like, getting fungus to grow in certain ways or whatever, like that's easy. It's predictable, right?
Yeah.
We could easily be cellular automata in some larger system where, you have the B.F. Skinner, Pavlov's dog. You have all these ways to like condition humans like extremely easily. Like that's not that hard.
Yeah.
And, how do we know that that's not being done to us on some sort of grand scale? And that's the Jacques Vallée kind of control system hypothesis.
No, that was one of the things that really turned me on was that. Well, here's an example just from the last 24 hours for me. Okay, so I live in a very small town in rural Kansas. Okay. And so, I'm here in Austin visiting you. And it's you walk around when you're used to being in a small town, and you're
Mm-hmm.
in this human context that's on this incredible scale,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you start to notice all the ways you're being managed just by the structure of the city and the
Mhm.
structure of the airport and all these ways. And you have this sudden sense you don't have the same feeling of control as you do, say, back in a small town. Right? Okay. And then it always strikes me whenever I fly into a major metropolitan area, how small and minor it looks on the landscape as you come in. Right.
Mm.
So it's like here, I have a sense of I'm somehow being moved around by a larger reality just by being in the city.
Mm.
But then if we move out our magnification a bit,
Mm.
we'll see the city as itself just part of this much bigger ecosystem of things, and it's not clear who's running that, et cetera, right? And so it seems like our level of magnification, right,
Yes.
like it affords different senses of what the real substance of things are.
Yes. And you start to get into weird ontological reality questions the more microscopic you get. Like, my old colleague Eric Weinstein likes to talk about, he talks about, and you write about this in your book, the Umwelt.
Yeah.
This sort of perceptive apparatus. He talks about science as like, a continuous process of Umwelt hacking.
He uses Umwelt.
He does.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I feel vindicated. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Or maybe he should be vindicated by you. But no, it is, or even, Feynman says there's room at the bottom, and he's implying that like the deeper your perceptive apparatus gets, the more you're able to probably understand, ontological truth. There's another physicist named Ken Wilson, where it's like the higher the energy output, maybe the more ontological truth you get. And he really talks about it in the case of, sort of phase transitions via materials. Like you put them under like high duress, you can understand properties that you wouldn't without the duress. But I do think of like, if we're in a cave, just, suspend disbelief, say we are just in this cave.
Well, so we are. I mean, it seems like everything
inherently we are.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Like everything we know about how cognition works, I think shows
I agree.
we are sorting for relevance.
Right.
And thereby we're ignoring more than, and we've been evolutionarily rewarded and like programmed to ignore some things.
So the two ways out of the cave would be building your own perceptive apparatus, like your own, working on your own kind of cognition and sort of raising your own consciousness. These things are very hard to talk about because it's hard to, there's no formula or whatever, but that would be one way. And then the second way might be sort of physics that breaks the boundaries of the cave. So it would be like lighting a firecracker in the cave or something. Well, and so I think about that with the nuclear UFO connection.
But I wonder about that even.
Yeah.
Because it's even, let's say we get, like another scientific revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it's still got to come back and be translated into the basic human cognitive setup.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's still going to have to like run on this hardware.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always going to go back to somehow traceable to, modes of cognition that were developed for our Paleolithic ancestors.
Yep. But I don't know. I mean, yes, but like the hardware is probably changing too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and it's always hard to say on what timescales things will happen because I'm, I believe in Darwin, but I believe in him as a locally useful and incomplete theory. Yeah, and I think
like Hoffman's thing.
The Hoffman's thing, or even like there these placeholder terms we use, like punctuated equilibria and evolution. And Karl Popper said,
you're dead right to say though, it's not like if we go the Darwinian route, okay, then the hardware is a moving target too.
Mm-hmm.
I agree,
mm-hmm.
right, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing of it though is any cognitive act that we would do to change the hardware would presuppose that prior hardware. So there's kind of a loop there. And you know what I mean? So like whatever could be that change, it's almost like it can't be within our direct control.
Explain. Say that again.
Well, you think that like if let's say we're going to reset our basic cognitive apparatus somehow, but we can only do that based on principles of our current cognitive apparatus, right? So we would never really be free of that, right? So it looks like you're going to have that kind of looping problem in there. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but then also you can measure a thing. Like
Yeah.
the Copenhagen school like measures like an
Yeah,
electron.
yeah.
And there's like this electron doesn't exhibit properties that like you look like normal macroscopic reality.
Right.
And then that like puts you into this brain scramble that like
Yeah.
you know
And then we're
increases
gonna-
your
we're gonna
evolution.
Theorize, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it is this like positive feedback
Yeah.
loop or something.
So the way I look at it is like we're always opening the scope
Mm-hmm.
on our Umwelt,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but it's still tethered to that original point, right? Because we got here through this evolutionary route, and that's always going to kind of flavor it, right? So I agree. Like what science does is it opens it, right?
Mhm.
And I would even say even humanities in some cases. I think literature can like
Mm-hmm.
open us to new reals and things like that. Okay, so it's opening it wider and wider and wider, but it's still always going to come back to that same origin point, and it's always limited. Then, yeah,
You have all these other myths that deal with technology development, and you know, like Prometheus being kind of the
I'm glad you
archetypal
brought
one,
that up, yeah.
or Faust. You know, and usually it doesn't end well for those
Yeah.
seeking the light.
Yeah.
So how do we interpret that in sort of a Platonic and UFO context?
So I got really obsessed with Sophocles' Prometheus Bound, the tragic
Mm-hmm.
play, and to the point I make all my students read it now. And it's interesting that so the start of Sophocles' version of the myth is Hephaestus, the god of smithing, is he's chaining up, nailing down Prometheus. Okay, which is ironic because like what did Prometheus do? Is he provided humans with all the arts, okay, like including smithing. So basically, Prometheus is being bound by technology. He's the god that gives us technology, but he is bound by technology.
Right.
And in Sophocles' version, Force, who speaks for Zeus, interesting, he's just pure blind force speaks there. And Hephaestus they're kind of mocking him, like, your name means foreknowledge and you didn't see this coming. And he's like, oh, bro, I saw it coming. I want this. Yeah, okay. And like later in the myth, he even says, I hate all gods. Right?
Wow.
Yeah. And he encounters Ion, who, Io, pardon me, who, who rejected Zeus, and she's a human, and gets turned to a cow, and he predicts a child of yours in the 13th generation. So it's going to be Hercules, right, as the prediction. But in the 13th generation, a human child, like long in the future, bad generation, is going to take out Zeus. Okay. You see that? And so like, there's this prediction of a kind of like, like death of God, assertive humanism that's going to come out of this, right? From a guy though, who is being nailed to a rock by technology itself, right? So you can see, I think even in Sophocles, there's a sense that humans are on rails to a kind of self-assertive self-destruction, right? Because we are these technological animals.
You know how we're always diving into the edge of science and consciousness on this show? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about aging, not just in terms of years, but in how it actually feels in the body. Slow recovery, lower energy, that middle-aged fog that sneaks up on you. I feel like I can barely go out and drink alcohol anymore. That's why I started using something called Qualia Senolytic, and it's been a major shift for me. Let me explain. As we age, our bodies accumulate what scientists call senescent cells, also known as zombie cells. These are worn out cells that stop dividing but don't die. They hang around in your body, draining your energy, clogging up your recovery, and generally making you feel older than you are. Qualia Senolytic is a first-of-its-kind supplement formulated with 9 plant-based compounds designed to help your body naturally eliminate these zombie cells. It's not something you take every day, just 2 days a month, but it supports your body in aging better at the cellular level. Since I've started taking it, I've felt sharper, lighter, and like my body's resilience has come back online. It's vegan, non-GMO, and grounded in serious research. Experience the science of feeling younger. Go to qualialife.com/Jesse for up to 50% off your purchase and use code Jesse. Again, that's JESSE for an additional 15% off. That's QUALIALIFE.com/Jesse, JESSE, for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks so much to Qualia for sponsoring this episode. What does that mean as far as our relationship to technology? One essay that you write about in your great book, and Diana Pasulka also talks about, is the question concerning technology, which is this Heidegger essay. I would be lying if I were to tell you that I understand this essay. I've tried to read it a couple of times.
Essay,
it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
It's difficult. Yeah. And that's not the place to start Heidegger, but it's like, it's where everybody wants to get to.
Yeah. I don't think I understand Heidegger in general, but
yeah. Okay. So, basically what Heidegger is arguing in that essay is the essence of technology isn't a device. Okay. And he's very explicit about that. So when Heidegger gets moody about technology, he's not just moody about how much like screen time we're having. Like, he wouldn't be a fan, but like, you know, for him, the essence of technology is a certain attitude towards being. Okay. Like, that's what technology really is. Okay. And Heidegger, you know, thinks it like there wasn't like a committee that met in the early modern period that decided we would just like change civilization. Okay. But he also thinks something happened such that we started to ask a different kind of question about nature than we did before. Okay. And he thinks what happened is, for some reason, we began to ask nature, what can we extract from it rather than how we can work with it. Okay. And so he thinks like what the essence of technology is an attitude of extraction or accessibility. Like what the world is simply the conditions at which it's accessible to us. Right. And he thinks he can trace that back as like, it's always been in the making throughout the entire Western philosophical tradition. And it really bubbled up in the modern period. Right. And so for him, like, he thinks there's no getting out of it, because like we didn't have a committee meeting to change our attitude, so we're not going to have a committee meeting to get out of it. It's like we have to ride this all the way down. Okay. But he thinks if we admit that we're stuck with this attitude, right? So like the world, like we're stuck thinking of the world simply on the terms that it's useful to us, right? If we make that admission, then we're kind of admitting we're not really running things, because we can't really decide this for ourselves. And he thinks that will open us to maybe something else could show itself to us that would change our attitude to being again. Yeah.
I maybe this is a contrived connection, but I think about that, you know, probably very true assertion that humans look at technology as this like, you know, locally useful thing for like producing, and then they port their own value into like, how can they work alongside technology to like make things more useful or more productive, which is a very narrow scope of like what it is to be human. Humans can write poetry, be self-referential, you know, like we create culture. But there's something about technology that compresses humans into, you know, this like economically productive unit.
So Heidegger was really worked up the first time he heard someone use the word human resources. Right. And he says, because eventually what's going to happen is we're going to see ourselves in technological terms of accessibility and use. And he's not just worried that like, you know, Soylent Green is people, like literally, but I think he is for
Right. Everybody, listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell him Silent Green is people.
But he's worried that then we'll only have a means and attitude to ourselves, to everything, and what his worry is this will lead us to what he calls a certain kind of oblivion to being. Right. Yeah. Is like an oblivion, like a forgetfulness again, right? Full circle to Plato here, like a forgetfulness of what being really is.
Yes.
Yeah. And we'll only see it as what it is to us, how we can access it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Soylent Green analogy is funny, you know, like that's an extreme, right? Where it's like, you know, the Charlton Heston movie that,
it's
you know,
a great metaphor though.
It's a great metaphor. And, you know, a la the Plato, where you never know if it's a metaphor or it's real.
Yeah.
I think he talks about 5 stages of technological development in that essay. And one of them is sacrifice.
Yeah.
And you think about a lot of like pagan scapegoating cycles and past efforts at garnering sacred knowledge or technology. And they involve like kind of brutal practices. And I think you could go all the way back to, you know, ancient practices to the Nazis trying to like sort of do this at scale for like forbidden knowledge and technology. And it's funny because, you know,
I think G.K. Chesterton actually draws, I think, a connection between, you know, sort of pre-scientific magic and technology. Yeah. And like human sacrifice and technology. The idea is that if we just had the right technique, we could force the world's hand to do what we want.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And certainly I think Girard would see something like that too. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. And there's a way in which tech used to be like, an augmentation of human. It was like an extra appendage or something.
Yeah.
And then, I think post-information revolution, it's sort of become this like parasitization of humans.
So Heidegger's like one of Heidegger's great examples is he compares like a hydroelectric dam to a medieval windmill, okay, or a medieval water mill, okay, because on those, like say in the medieval versions, and I'm not saying we peaked in the 12th century or something like that. Like I'm glad my wife can vote, right? Okay,
Yeah.
But like with the medieval windmill, it works when the wind blows, okay. So you're going to like build something that makes you have to work along with nature.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Whereas the hydroelectric dam, for all its virtues, though, it's saying, nature, I will take from you what I want and store it.
Yep.
So it's all on our terms, right?
Yes.
And it's about how we access you, right? And not how can we work with you.
Yeah. It's mastery over nature in a way. Yeah. It's not just harmonizing with nature.
Yeah.
And those two things are very distinct. I mean, there are two competing theories of the inevitability of human evolution or of existence on Earth. And there's the Gaia James Lovelock theory that, the Earth is somehow like super resilient. And so like we might come and go, but the Earth will always sort of come back. And then there's the Medea theory, which is like, we inevitably will like blow ourselves up. And like, that maybe there's some evidence that happened on Mars or something. And, they're sort of competing. There's and definitely modern tech seems to be in the category of just being able. How do we control everything?
Yeah.
And if you think about VR is like that to the limit, where it's like the entire world that like we might be living in like is controllable. And so I don't know, taking it like one step farther with the Plato thing. Do you ever think like this is like we're in these like biological skin suits?
Yeah,
that are basically like VR headsets. And the contemplation of virtue or some other criteria that we don't fully understand are the means through which we ascend through these things into the light and become even worthy of that next step outside of the cave. Because I also thought, the Heidegger thing might connect where it's like we're porting ourselves through these like low-level economic production engines via technology. I believe that also kind of dovetails with a test that Plato puts the guardians through, like at the age of 30 or whatever. If you fail, like you don't get to study metaphysics. You just like become the economic producer or whatever.
Yeah. So I think at this point is where like a Heidegger and Plato come apart. Okay, or at least this is where Heidegger becomes a critic of Plato's. Okay, because he would look at something like that dialectical process in the Republic, whereby one like ascends to a kind of enlightenment as a quasi-technological attitude. Okay. And whereas for Heidegger, for him, the metaphor is more like architectural. Like you build a temple and you hope someone shows up there. Right? Okay. And a lot of his later work goes to this, where he talks about how we need artwork. Okay. But meaning we need art that does the work of art. And what is the work of art? Is it provides a place, sort of like a theater where an actor could show up for us. Okay. So for Heidegger, it's like we're more passive in the process. Okay. Than say for Plato, where we'd be more active in the process. Like there would be, an educational process that one could go through, right? That would get you there, right? Whereas for Heidegger, it's like, well, if divinity is going to show up for us, right? If the transcendence is going to show up for us, then it cannot be our doing. Like, and he thinks what's happened in the modern world is because we only think of like what we can take and do and grab and process, right? We need to regain an ability just to build something that is sort of receptive rather than aggressively extracting. Do you see that? And I think for me, I probably lean more towards Heidegger on that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, speaking of that, is the UFO a technology that sort of is, if there's a push and a pull outside of the cave or whatever, is the UFO some sort of pulling technology, because you talk about this where it's this thing that it busts all of your priors.
Yeah.
It's like you have all these like prior categorization techniques.
I didn't want to talk about this, right?
Yeah,
today I did, but like early, 5 years ago. Like,
but you find yourself obsessed because it's inherently kind of uncategorizable.
Yeah, that's kind of where I land with the UFO is it seems like something's knocking. Right. There's some, and maybe it's always been knocking at the door, right? Because we have different metaphors for it throughout history, but it seems like something's knocking. Right. And whether we listen to it through a Platonic, process of dialectical improvement, or we listen to it through a sort of Heideggerian building a place where it could dwell, right? That it seems that something is trying to remind the human of something, right? That's just trying to jog our memories. Like I like to use Plato's metaphor. And I'm not really like, I don't trust any of our metaphors about it. Is it an angel? Is it a demon? Is it, is it an elf or a fairy? It seems that all of that gives our imagination too much of a pass, right? But it does seem there is some pressure on us from outside our Umwelt, right? That we would do well to at least strategize how we would listen to. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. And so like, how does any of this comport with like the way we discuss this stuff in a government context? Because, we have like, we're talking at an extremely high abstract level of the kind of ontological truth. And then there are government whistleblowers coming out of, saying that they've retrieved UFOs, one of whom I've had on my show. And like, it's kind of hard to poke holes in his story. Like, felt like, pretty prima facie, at least, very, very, like an honest account. And so how do we square that circle?
I don't know. I don't know that I can. And because for me, and this is not, I am not like calling anyone into question or anything like that, but I have no special access to anything. I'm just an average dude, right? Okay. Right. And so I have to always ask myself, like, what's more likely? Like what this person's telling me is true. And they could be speaking a falsehood and not be lying. I'm not saying anyone's lying or anything like that. But like, you always have to weigh is this testimony true, right? Against the probability that this person's been somehow deceived or et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just taking like whether, it's any of the whistleblowers, I don't know how I can really weigh that out.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? So like, let's say, we talk to whistleblower, Roy, right? Okay.
Sure.
And, we ask Roy, hey, you've been told this, and this by all these people.
Yep.
And it seems unlikely that they're all in on something. That seems unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay? But then it seems really unlikely that these things they're telling you is true too.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Of course.
So this is an old argument from David Hume about miracles. And so we have to weigh that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like I can't even really make a meaningful comparison of those probabilities.
Well, I would say in the world in which like forbidden knowledge is a real thing.
Yes.
That there's some, cleaving off of like black world science or knowledge. The government would be attempting systematically to get that, just from a game theory, geopolitical lens.
You have to assign some plausibility.
Yep.
To like maybe, well, the thing is as soon as we do that, and this gives me fits. So as soon as so I think no matter what now, you've got to have a pretty unlikely conspiracy theory because either like this has been covered up for 75 years, right? You know what I mean? Or there's something really weird going on now where it seems like now people want us to believe it.
Right.
So either way, you've got like a prima facie low probability conspiracy theory you're going to have to take.
Yeah.
One or another, right?
And then I always ask myself the question, like, because of course you have to go back and forth, but like, I'm like, why are some of these people are like very high level in prosaically important government, military, and science roles. I'm like, if we are in some like multipolar new Cold War, why are you systematically sending all of these top guys to like psyop the American population?
I know.
That seems crazy.
Yeah.
That seems crazier than, as a null hypothesis than the inverse, which is just like, actually, this has been going on for, thousands of years.
See, there's where I think you and I come apart. I don't know which is crazier.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well, I'm more in that, like, I'm wading through the waters of speaking to all these people.
But I think, I do think you have to say now that, I mean, it's been on the floor of the Congress and things like that.
Yeah.
That's got to pump the probability up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You know, but not, I don't know if all the way.
Yep.
Right. Because,
well, it's funny, like as I say things, like people don't think correctly, I think, and so that's a sort of crazy thing for me to say.
I know,
but it's like you could just say like New York Times, Congress, Schumer Amendment. You know, you say these things, somebody who holds a Q clearance, and then all of a sudden they go, oh, credentials. They go, whatever you say next as far as what they believe, I now believe. And then you could go into all these sort of first principles, like more interesting inquiries into like how reality works, a la what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's, you know, not even wrong or like unfalsifiable or like crazy or whatever. Cause you need to somehow, their receptors around like, you know, credentialism need to be like met first. And then they're like, oh, well, let me listen, you know. It's like, that's just not the way you should inquire.
Sort of, you might have heard about some of the honest placebo studies.
No.
Okay, so apparently, I'm probably not getting all the details right, but apparently there are cases where there have been experiments where they told people, this is a placebo, this is an inert substance, and we're giving it to you.
It still helped. I believe that.
If the person giving it to them still had like the lab coat, right, and the it was in the right kind of packaging, like so, like if some dude shows up at the door and gives you a bag of pills, and it's probably not going to work, right?
Yeah.
But like if someone dresses up like a doctor, like an authority figure, all the credentials, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to really mistrust.
Totally. Well, and there's certain people who have an a priori disposition towards magic, and then others who don't.
Yeah.
And then that becomes their reality. Like it's like the Plato thing where it's like everything I'm going to tell you is a lie. And they're like, then why would you say that? And you get all confused. And then he goes on to tell some like stuff that like there's clearly some truth in it.
Exactly.
And then, maybe there's some lies, but like you're extremely intrigued. There are layers to, there's this like Leo Strauss, this, 20th century philosopher. He was a big, Platonist too.
But he also thought those books were full of lies too.
Totally. But then you never know if he was writing in a coded fashion himself. And so it was like, and then like the people around him like had these like weird communication techniques. And so it's this never ending thing. And you could say the exoteric is implying meaning that doesn't exist,
right?
And the esoteric is like the room and is actually empty when you get to it, and it's like it's all some coordination mechanism. Or you could say the exoteric is throwing people off the trail, and and the more you like talk about that from a meta sense, then you're going and you've created this cult.
Yes.
And it's
and so I actually do this in the book where I say, okay, using the example of the Tic Tac. Okay, so what's my evidence of the Tic Tac? Well, this seemingly very reliable Air Force pilot, and and Alex Dietrich and David Fravor, they said these things, right?
Raytheon FLIR systems.
Yeah, okay. And so I have like testimony from seemingly reliable people, right? Okay. And if you say, but it like, how can you buy that? But yet, like, I only know Bin Laden was shot.
Yep.
Because of testimony
media.
From that came through the media through reliable like Pentagon officials. I only know. And now, of course, maybe some of that stuff we shouldn't be so quick to believe too. Do you know what I mean? But it seems to me you've got to put it on the spectrum of believability now.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you say like we detected a quark or whatever through like some particle accelerator,
I'd have to take Eric's word for that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and Eric is taking other people's word for that because he's a theoretical guy and he's not doing the experiments. And so it's the consensus reality, if you really get down to it, can just be totally managed.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that has been known since Plato.
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I agree. And so what do I do with like, say, disclosure movement, stuff like that?
Yeah.
And the UFO is I'll admit, I now am like self-consciously aloof to it.
That's cool. I like that. I'm starting to be like that too.
Yeah.
I had a friend tell me yesterday or 2 days ago, Chris Ramsey has a great channel called Area 52. He goes, I'm not really into disclosure. He's like, I'm into UFOs. Yeah. And I was like, I like that. Yeah. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. This whole like dramatic process of like these people and the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's fascinating. And I find some of the people very heroic and courageous. And I've loved all of the people who I've been lucky enough to have access to on the show. But ultimately, it's like, does that get you closer to some primordial truth? Is there, there are plenty of things can be true, little t true or whatever, and there can be ulterior motives involved as well. And it's
Totally.
to me, it's a lens through which you can, go to the deeper stuff.
Yeah.
And some of them are going through their own processes and journeys. You talk to Jake Barber, David Grush, or any of these people, like it's opened up their worldview, and they're like, they're diving into like what they want to know about like reality as well. But some of the contemporary kind of, drama is not, always the best inroad.
And right now, let's say, you said, we're off the air, Jim, and I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
Here's what they showed me.
Yeah.
I got the real stuff.
Yeah,
I would have to say, okay, but then why would I believe Jesse?
Yeah, totally.
Do you?
Why are you showing me?
Yeah, why are you showing me? You know what I mean? So it seems like, and this is like one of the frustrations, but even if you found out, you haven't found out.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why, if I had to make a prediction, I think contact or like true, like more disclosure, disclosure will be inherently this sort of jagged process. Well, you'll have 20% of the population still holding out saying like, this is just impossible or whatever.
Yeah.
But, say there's some big event in the next few years, my strong bias would be that event does not come through some like power structure on down disseminated message from like government officials. It's like some weird surprising thing.
Yeah.
And if it's not that, it won't hit people epistemically in the right way.
Yeah, because think of it,
because they'll be skeptical forever.
So think of it like right now, evolution has been taught in public schools, at least in most private schools for generations, right? But how many Americans believe it?
Yeah,
not everyone. Yeah, like the Big Bang's been taught.
Yeah,
how many Americans believe it?
Yeah,
not everyone. You know what I mean? So it's like you could even have something become like educational orthodoxy.
Yeah,
and it doesn't necessarily move the needle for everyone.
Yeah.
Right? So like what would even like disclosure look like in a way that actually had grip on people's daily lives? Right?
Totally. Yeah. And then and then it's like, okay, you see a saucer and a hanger. The hanger's at an official site. You see some government official who you trust because they're cabinet level or they're the president unveiling the thing. You have all these questions. Then you step inside the thing. You have all these questions.
Yeah.
The scientists probably working on this stuff don't know exactly what they're looking at and have all these questions. And so it becomes this never-ending quest.
Yeah.
The philosophical question of like, what is disclosure? And meanwhile, what you could be doing is just working on your own perceptive filter or apparatus. If you treat yourself like an Umwelt, lens or whatever, work on the lens.
Yeah. And so for me, it becomes, less, what are we going to like, not that even really ever was like, what are we going to get the government to tell us?
Mm-hmm.
It's more, can I come up with a philosophical, metaphysical, cognitive model where it makes sense?
Yeah.
That like where we would expect the unexpected to happen. And I think, we can. I think that does make perfectly good sense. Right.
Yeah.
And so then the question now is just, okay, how do we digest that? Right. For ourselves in our friendships, in our classrooms, all that. That becomes it. Right. I'm not looking for authorities to tell me what to do. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's you become limited in your ability to derive truth if you inherently, if you do that. And I think, I don't know, I'm curious to get your take, but I think we are literally in Plato's cave. And not only all the stuff we talked about around like decibel ranges or electromagnetic wave spectrums, but look at like physics itself. There's, the weak anthropic principle and there's a strong anthropic principle. And the strong anthropic principle is like, well, eventually like you'll have enough iterations that like the universe will foster life. And then the weak anthropic principle is like the limits of our perceptive capabilities like make physics comport with our perceptive capability, which is so obviously true. Like I think the idea that Planck's constant, if you were to change it slightly, like you wouldn't have a habitable Earth, doesn't point towards like, oh, you had like a million tries and this was like the right try. To me, it's like physics itself is comporting to our perceptive limitations. And again, that's like an unanswerable question. You can endlessly sort of debate
how are we
that,
ever going to tease out the human from the non-human?
Mm-hmm.
Well, once we admit there's a human contribution to any of our teasing out,
yes,
we're always going to be like loop it. Yeah.
Yes, but and then the second you admit that the observer observed distinction breaks down,
Yeah.
which like Jung would say, I don't know, a bunch of people would say,
Yeah.
like, you then have to like look inwards, and
Yeah.
you don't have to look inwards. If you are this like, you know, in just this biochemical like meat suit, you know, happy accident, then it's like you feel sad, like take an SSRI, like
Right.
you know, you're confused about something, like, you know, just learn the trite information. There's very little aesthetic sense as to how to decode yourself.
Right.
And I do think like this to the limit ends up in this sort of endless interiority kind of self-indulgence thing. But I think a lot of people miss that today as to how to sort of grow your own abilities
that's a
to
really
perceive.
good point, Jesse. I think there's a difference between this sort of really like kind of facile work on yourself thing, right? And as opposed to like, what would it be to cultivate real interiority? Right. Yeah. And I think it's a really great distinction. Yeah.
Do you think like the next epistemological or scientific paradigm involves bringing the observer into, you know, the observed, or there's something about working on us that coincides with what we perceive? I mean, this would go back to like alchemy itself, which a lot of the early scientists
in a lot of ways, although we could talk about how it's gone off the rails, right? Like this has been, you know, one of the central philosophical paradigms since Kant, right? You know, where like once we try to tease out the noumenal from the phenomenal, right? You know, that for us, as opposed to that which things are in themselves, Kant's like, you'll get nowhere except ethically, right? He thinks we can know things in themselves in terms of like moral matters, right? But that's it. And so I think in much of Western philosophy since Kant has like been dealing with that. Now it's gone off the rails really badly in many ways. Okay. But I think, and then we can look in the sciences, you know, hard sciences, the same thing, like the, you know, like this idea that we're ever going to like tease out the observer from the observed. Yeah. Right. You know, in a lot of ways, this already is the paradigm in a lot of like serious thought. It's just the word just never gets out. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah.
It's also interesting how science itself might be converging on more of a Platonic worldview, where you have in increasing popularity the work of like Rupert Sheldrake, you know, these morphic fields, or Michael Levin, where there's this interaction between biological forms and their local information fields that dictate their morphology or function in the case of like inherited learnings. That seem to transcend pure kind of genetic inheritance, and often comports with, I mean, who knows if this like theory of consciousness is correct with microtubules, with, you know, Roger Penrose has this orchestrated objective reduction thing, but that involves these like, you know, pyramidal tubulin structures in the brain, you know, it all, maybe we end up just back to like Hellenic times, like talking about these like, you know, sacred geometry and stuff.
Well, you know, a little off that, but like overlapping, you know, Sheldrake has this really interesting paper, Is the Sun Conscious?
I love that.
Which he answers affirmatively, right? And you can see similar work. I'm forgetting his name now, but an American analytic philosopher in the last few years published a paper arguing that the United States is probably a conscious entity. And both Sheldrake and this other paper are making the point that, well, if we know that a certain kind of organization causes the emergence of consciousness in us, and I think whatever you think consciousness is, it's hard to deny that where these organizational structures show up, you get consciousness, right? Well, Sheldrake makes the point, well, it looks like we can see those kinds of organizations in other places. And he makes a case, maybe the sun, et cetera, right? And so then I think what you're doing is you're getting a universe suffused with consciousness, right? But in a way that isn't like irresponsibly spooky either. Yeah. I think that's very important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like sort of fractals of consciousness on up, and there's a sort of cybernetic village or something. And then there's the individual nodes. Yeah. And even, you know, if you think of us as like individual nodes, that totally comports with Sheldrake's stuff around, you know, if you grow an organic crystal structure, you can then grow that crystal structure much faster on an ongoing basis. Or like, look at athletic accomplishments, which is similar to isomorphic resonance.
The one guy breaks the 4-minute mile, then a bunch.
Exactly, the Bannister effect. And if you think about how computers work in you know, kind of node systems, download times are much faster than upload times.
Yeah.
So the first time you do a thing, it's going to be really hard and it's going to be, really painful. And then the second time anybody even related to you in your node network does it because they're, querying it from some central monad repository of information, that download is going to be much faster.
I did not know that with the download upload. Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Like literally like the way and then you get into all sorts of interesting stuff around, what is DNA? It looks like binary code.
And what you're moving to there is then like a fundamentally networked world.
Yes.
Yes.
And but in a way that comports with literal observable science.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm buddies with this guy Jim Keller, who's this legendary chip maker. Like the iPhones and the chips in many of our iPhones, like literally are based off of his architecture. He worked at Tesla, and he's like, it is remarkable how much human. The human looks like a semiconductor in many ways, and he goes through all these specifics around that, and like how we're like conductive, and then he goes through the DNA and like it's like binary code, it's like transistors, and then this you have this burgeoning field of quantum biology, and so you have to wonder, are we getting information from like non-local, William James would say, like there's some sort of transmission going on, and if you're put a person in a Faraday cage, the fact that they can think points against that theory, because if you were getting it from a traditional RF signal, the Faraday cage would kill the RF signal. But if you get into these like weird, spooky new science called, extended electrodynamics, where you have these sort of scalar, field, wave types or whatever, which a lot of people seemingly, high up in government seem to get behind, then maybe the sun is a scalar wave generator, and then maybe we're getting information from the sun and getting information from all sorts of places. And maybe the Aristotelian model of the sun, being the source of like knowledge is just true or something.
Yeah. And I think on a lot of that stuff too is like, okay, without getting hung up on like the Aristotelian science, because I think as soon as we say that, like, oh, are we geocentrist now? No, that's not the point, right? The point though is the world a set of interlocking conscious hierarchies, right? I think that's the question. Yeah.
And that Aristotle seems to be, I mean, you write about it, that the existence of non-human intelligence or aliens totally comports with an Aristotelian worldview.
I mean, they're not, for Aristotle, literally the planets are intelligences, right? So they're not flying ships or something like that. But the idea that things are in a way affected or managed by non-human intelligence for Aristotle is apparent in his view. Yeah.
Do you think that, the AI is like all the rage right now, that maybe our world is being sort of managed by an AI system that knows how to, the Jacques Vallée control system thing, it knows how to nip at the herd. So like a nuke, is about to go off, it shows up. A human node like reaches a certain state of consciousness, it shows up. And it's like this sort of like Earth sustenance kit. And we're not seeing the aliens. We're seeing like the envoys that the von Neumann replicators that they sent out to like manage us.
So there's a film that I saw in high school, right? That like, it's been with me since then, right? And it's based on a novel, Failsafe. Okay. And I think it was originally made in like 1963, 64. Okay. So it's a Cold War film about a nuclear war that gets started by accident. Okay. And throughout the film, it like really what we're being shown is how humans have become utterly irrelevant to the process. Okay. Like it's in like there's early in the film, there's like people are regretting that we have to use humans. Okay. All right. So the human is becoming irrelevant, and it's very clear in the film. And this is before, in the popular imagination, artificial intelligence is a thing. Like that's not a proposal of the film at all, but already just based on regular mechanical operations, the film is proposing that we are being run. We are being run by things that we put into play. Okay. And the kind of rationality this is lending us to is like, it's sort of like, I think in a lot of ways, AI is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the more we think in terms of certain kinds of mechanical intelligence, right? The more we make ourselves easier to mimic by machines. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And so already in the 1950s and 60s, people were worried that we're putting technological balls into play that will come back to us as if gods. You should,
yeah.
Right. There's some I refer to in the book as a very underappreciated 20th century philosopher, Gunther Anders. This is definitely something he's worried about, that we're like he thinks we're creating Prometheus.
Yes.
We're letting Prometheus loose.
Yes.
And then in these technologies, and then those things will come back and run us. Right?
Yeah. It's like creating a golem or summoning a demon or something.
Yeah.
And then you sort of obsolete yourself in the process.
And you can, and already in the 50s and 60s, before there was any hint of AI in the popular imagination.
Yep.
This notion of human obsolescence was already in play.
Totally.
That we are going to make ourselves irrelevant to the world that we're making.
The best you can do at that point is let the program run and probably try to think about what makes you unique from the machine.
Yeah, exactly.
And then try to ascend out of, whatever paradigm you're existing in. But I do, this obsession with AI, VR, or whatever. It's like, if we're in a cave, why would you port yourself into like a lower level, more bit compressed cave?
We're like demoting ourselves.
You're demoting yourself.
Yeah.
And like, we're willfully doing that when like this whole thing could be a test.
Yeah.
And so I always found that so fascinating with this sort of obsession with like, we need to build like higher fidelity worlds. Like if you watch Ready Player One, that's not like a good world. Like the guy's living in a shanty town. And then like the AI VR thing is like an escape.
Yeah. So a lot of times people ask me, am I worried about AI, et cetera, et cetera? And my reply is, I think the game was done 80 years ago.
Right.
I think like, I would even look at things like the Manhattan Project, where you had this thing, this like technological hyper object that like took off and like nobody really knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Think of like, if you watch the film Oppenheimer, like you get 3 different answers from Oppenheimer why he wants to do this.
Yeah.
So like, it's who's running this now?
Yeah.
The technology is running this. Prometheus is running it.
Completely. Yeah. And it's such a fascinating time where it was like clearly this big inflection point. He had such interesting philosophical kind of objections around what he was doing. He was sort of reluctantly doing it, but he like, he needed to do it on some level.
It's just going to happen.
It was just going to happen or something. And then he kind of decamped from that. And it was like Teller was more in that sort of, it's going to happen, so we might as well sort of build it ourselves. And it is this very Promethean, Faustian sort of story. And it's ultimately kind of tragic. And then it also, you have to wonder at that time, because that's when all the UFOs pop up.
Exactly.
In our visible reality, at least according to all the lore. And there's a lot of lore.
Or under this new interpretation, like appearing as technology, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's also like maybe, to the extent the Guardians want to keep the test going or something.
Yeah.
If we build like a firecracker in the cave, or we build a bomb in the cave, they're trying to like diffuse like, some of these things, like keep the test going or whatever. And, it's like, does something super unprecedented happen when we discover, the myth makers, when we develop the perceptive apparatuses through high energy output or through some sort of ascended consciousness to like see who's like messing with us.
Yeah.
And does that just unravel reality?
And think of like the cosmic meaning of like humanity discovering that we could take ourselves out. Do you see? You know what I mean? Like, like it has to change us in ways that none of us have probably really dealt with.
Yes.
In our unconscious, right? Like
yes.
That we now know collective suicide is a possibility for humanity.
Yes.
Which was not an option until the 1940s.
Yeah.
And so what like how is that a firecracker going off in our belt?
Yes.
Like how is that going to change our ability to see what's there or miss what's there, et cetera, et cetera? Like it has to have an effect, right? This is part of Jung's point. Yeah,
totally. And so what role does religion play in all of this? Because I love you talk about this, like Janus, the two-sided face or whatever. That religion plays a dual role of sort of sending you down the wrong path at times, but also pointing you to the sacred.
Yeah.
And so, Yeah. Well, how do you view religion?
There's this really interesting passage from Aristotle that I use in the book where he's just gotten to the end of his natural theology. So he's just given his argument for an unmoved mover. And along with that comes this whole kind of romantic cosmology, of his. I don't mean that in a dismissive way, right? But like where everything's revolving, trying to get to the unmoved mover and all this. Okay. And then he says, this shows that our most ancient ancestors were not wrong when they posited that there was a divinity surrounding nature and things happen according to the means of divinity or something like that. But then he says, however, that got co-opted into stories that were told for legal purposes. Okay. So he kind of gives you a Nietzschean genealogy right there of the going Greek religion. Right. And then he ends the passage by saying, but we can be interested in these more primordial tales because they now fit with what we're discovering philosophically. Okay. So it seems for Aristotle, religion can go two ways, right? It can be co-opted into these, legal political things, right? Or it can be a way of sort of, I think what he's saying here is like a kind of intuitive revelation can be out in front of what we can prove scientifically, philosophically, and like kind of guide the inquiry in a way. Right? Yeah. So he's worried about how the religious interpretation of this stuff can be co-opted, right? But it doesn't have to be either.
And you have, speaking of true knowledge as some sort of sense memory.
Yeah.
That is not, the five sort of lower senses.
Yeah.
And, we should probably talk about the myth of air, which, the end of the Plato's Republic, which you talked about. That is such a fascinating myth. Also kind of, I think, dogmatically taken as allegory by, modern scholars.
Yeah.
What do you make of that story? And maybe rehash the story for the audience.
Yeah. So, in the Republic, was a virtuous person. He dies in battle for the city. That does all the Greek good stuff. Right. And he goes, and then it's all wound up with fairly conventional, Athenian views about the afterlife. So he crosses the river Styx and, all the right gods are there. But then it comes to a point where, there's kind of a drawing of lots, for where you're going to go in the next life. Okay. And what's interesting is one of the great rewards of the virtuous is they don't care what lot they get because they know no matter what, they'll be okay because they're going to have the excellences that carry them through. They'll have it. Right. Okay. So that's interesting. All right. And so everyone gets their assigned position for the next life and then they return. And interestingly, we mentioned this earlier. They all have to sleep next to the river of forgetfulness before they return, but the only one who doesn't drink is Okay. So the virtuous person remembers, right? And now, the virtuous person is indifferent to their lot in temporal life. Okay. Why? Because they remember, right? Because they know there's something else. Do you see that? So I know people will make something of it. Is this a recollection of a near-death experience for Plato, or maybe like the Eleusinian mysteries? Something maybe. Like I'm perfectly open to that, right? I don't really have the classical scholarship to weigh in on that, right? But I do think what we're being told there is there's a kind of confidence, right, in the virtuous person, right, and a kind of in touch with. Right. I just put it an in touch with being, right? With the good that the virtuous person has.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what I mean? So that is to take it allegorically, but it's in a way that would like make a concrete difference for conduct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think that Plato, cause I look at the Eleusinian mysteries and I know, it's probably hard to say historically whether these, what exactly happened here. Brian Murarescu writes a great book.
Though, yeah.
They were definitely up to something.
Yeah.
You have this place 13 miles northwest of Athens, this, considered the spiritual capital, that, you had, Greek leaders and Roman emperors saying this sort of held together society, the fabric of society. And you'd have these sort of, guardians back then, if you will, Plato, Socrates, Sophocles, Alcibiades was famously in trouble for talking about the mysteries when he wasn't, he was at a festival.
First rule of Fight Club, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Don't talk about it. and they all undergo these sort of, they drink the Kekion, which is maybe, as speculated by Brian Murarescu, this sort of ergot that contains LSD, this sort of fungal derivative.
What was wine in the ancient world, right? And could it have been spiked with mushrooms or other visionary plants, hallucinogenic herbs, toxins? I think that is a really interesting question. And
that unveils this sort of greater ontological reality, or maybe they experience noesis, kind of primordial knowledge or something. Do you think that was real and informed Plato?
I have no reason to rule that out.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? You know what I mean? And like in a lot of ways, it's not like it's not like we discovered, like peyote at Woodstock.
Do you know what
I mean? Like this stuff has been around, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think there's, you know what I mean? So I would be surprised if that wasn't, and we know it's been around in religion and all that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, in like various pagan religions, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Right? So I'd be surprised if there wasn't something like that going on. Does that make sense?
It does. It's just so funny how we, in the modern age of disenchantment, paint Plato over with this broad brush of like, it's all allegory. He is the father of Western civilization. It's the birth of rationalism. And it's like, well, I don't know. I think the guy was going to Eleusis and drinking some weird shit.
Especially when you read some of the dialogues like Phaedrus and the Symposium. Desire and love are running a lot, right? Okay. And I think that's important to note, right? And I think whatever the mysteries were, right? It does seem like it worked like this, is like you got like a cheat code to the goal line, right? And then you go back and spend the rest of your life trying to think your way back to it. Do you see what I mean?
I do. You immediately like can't fully recollect what you saw with the light. It's almost like, I was actually talking to David Grush about this in my interview with him, and he was like, it's almost like the symbol rate is too slow. Like you literally can't even communicate it in words.
How do you show the light by which we see other things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So you end up, maybe Jesus was one of these people, maybe not, but like prophets famously speak in riddles and allegories and parables, and it's you have to parse their word. I mean, you get the sense, we were talking before the show, Jacques Vallée, was just on Joe Rogan, and when I speak to Jacques, I get the sense that he knows a lot more than he can even communicate with this stuff. And he speaks in these sort of riddled, coded parables.
And not just because of like security clearance. Like it's inarticulable.
It's inarticulable. And like, the message will, it's like the people with ears to hear. Like the message will reach the right people. But it's not like this thing where it's like, this happened at this time. You get it now? This is it. That's it. It's like, no, if you kind of if you knew that, you'd ask more questions. And it's just, whatever the truth is like inherently hard to
I've been reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's horror stories lately. Right. Maybe more than I should, but it's interesting. Like so Lovecraft has this like really pessimistic, dark view of the world. Right? Okay. But yet there's always this other thing that's operating, that's inarticulable. You know what I mean? And so it seems like even someone like Lovecraft, who has this just dark view of the universe and it's hopeless. There's still this like Schopenhauerian will operating, but he can't articulate it for you. Or the characters can't articulate it. Right? It's always, it was there. Right? Yeah. And I think, although I don't think Plato has that dark sense, but you have a similar thing in Plato, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of us have this sense that there's another factor.
Yeah, totally. Or like when I was speaking to Diana Pasulka, she said like, Christians are not of this world. And it was both this very hopeful statement, where it's like, there's other stuff out there, and like maybe the kingdom of heaven is real. But it was this extremely, on the flip side of that, it was almost not nihilistic because you have that other thing there. But it was like, this world sucks and it isn't going anywhere super positive, and like at most you can like save yourself and then like hope to tip off the initiation of like a few other people or whatever, and that's it. It's like the idea of saving this world that's tough. And I find it true to me too, when I don't know, when somebody has some super virtue signally, like, I'm going to save a world. Think about like the 20th century is sort of the age of ideology and utopian sort of, like visions. And they all ended up in like mass death and like extremely dysfunctional. So like the technocratic solutions don't really work.
So at a certain point in the Republic, I forget whether it's Glaucon or Adamantus, it says, they've just got through, some of the absurdities, like we're going to have to share wives and we're going to take your kids, you won't raise your own kids. And like, sex will only happen once a year at like a rigged lottery at spring break kind of thing.
Right.
Okay. All this stuff. And one of the guys says, I don't want to, this is terrible. No one's going to do this. Like this is unworkable. Right. And Socrates replies by saying, oh yeah, you're right, but it's the ideal. Okay. And he says, if I painted you a picture of the most beautiful human form, and he said, well, no one looks like that, that still wouldn't mean it wasn't the most. And I don't think Plato's necessarily saying like the rigged spring break lottery for mating is like the way that's not the point. But the point is like, you are not going to find the ideal here.
Yeah.
Right? It's not here. And so whatever your expectations for it are, they're off.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And think of how in the Republic, right, the what we talked about earlier, the problem of founding, like we're not going to make an ideal happen here. Right? It's always going to collapse on itself. Right? And in the Timaeus, which is sort of a sequel to the Republic, right? It's like the day after the party. And Socrates says, hey, I'm troubled that we couldn't see the ideal in the real, right? We never got to a concrete instance of it, right? So he assembles some politicians to say, tell me what the ideal city would be. And the closest he gets to an answer is from Critias, who tells him a myth, another good lie about this great war between ancient Athens and Atlantis, right? But once again, it's like it's sketchy. It was heard by Solon in Egypt at a children's party from a priest whose name means deception and all this. Like, okay, so it's like Plato's saying we don't really ever get to see the ideal, right? In the concrete world, right? And then you get this creation myth again, right? In the Timaeus, where this world is just a symbol of this other thing. It's a symbol of another thing. And think of it, symbols again don't really represent, they help you recollect something.
Yes. Yeah. We're like a simulacra or like a fallen version of the thing.
Yeah.
That's so, it's fascinating.
Right. But also though, I think it's a fair perennial criticism of Plato that like there are consequences to saying this world is worthless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's why, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong in interpreting him this way, but I think the postmodern simulation theory is extremely nihilistic. It's like, okay, we're all in a simulation, play Grand Theft Auto. Like that's bad. Yeah. And then I my sense is that in Plato's case, it's more meaningful.
Yeah. I could think of no better metaphor to prepare people to have bad lives.
Right.
Than like the simulation
theory. Right. So you're like, you're playing a video game, nothing matters, you know? Yeah. But then there's this other thing where it's like, you might be in somewhat of a kind of video game, like physics might be like tuned to your your perceptive apparatus, and like you're being sort of tested, and you're seeing these simulacra, like you're not seeing the ideal forms or whatever, but there's another level, and the other level involves goodness, and and so I don't know, I mean, that I would hope that interpretation of Plato is correct, and then I don't know if I'm correct in believing that, but
you would not get trouble from me.
Okay, well, thanks. Awesome. So Glaucon also says, when speaking about the cave, he says, are there protocols that allow us to ascend outside of the cave? Yeah. And I asked Jacques Vallée this. I said, are there protocols? And he's like, yes, there are. And then, I don't know, he went on to again, speaking, typically kind of coded fashion. Yeah. Do you think there are protocols?
I mean, I don't know that there's anything fancier than what you have in like your basic Greek ethics, right? You know what I mean? Like, don't allow irrational passion to run your life, right? Know thyself, right? Do you know what I mean? Like
those are the protocols.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's certainly in the Republic, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, those are the protocols.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so funny because in modern UFO world,
lots of junk food is probably not good for that. I agree, right?
Yeah. No, it's like maybe it's often I find when I speak to people who are like really into like theurgy or like like celestial ascent or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like they've got to just fix a bunch of local things in their life.
Yeah.
And the ascent thing is just this escape thing. And I've fallen prey to this in the past where I'm like, it would be really cool to like shoot up on a UFO into like some other realm or whatever, like, Enoch style or, whatever. But like, I do think reality is probably, the cave is probably constructed super deliberately.
Yeah.
Whereby, whatever issues you're facing have to be solved karmically in this world in like a very just banal local sense.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to set myself up to be some model or something like that. Okay. But I was at a conference several years ago, and I was talking to some like very, very, high achieving scientists, neuroscientists who are looking at the psychedelic questions. Okay. And they were talking about like all the benefits for like marriage and things that were being found out around some of these things and like all overall stuff. And one of them was a very good friend of mine. I asked him afterwards, I said, so, a lot of what you're talking about there just sounds like what I've come to just thinking about stuff for like 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah, exactly. It was like,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like the original protocol was a kind of life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I have a friend who says like life is like surfing, psychedelics are like snowboarding.
Yeah.
Snowboarding, you get really hurt.
Yeah.
And you have to, you start at the top of the mountain and you got to go down, you got to make it all the way down.
Yeah.
Surfing's just this sort of well-earned thing where you have to like catch each and every wave or whatever. And it does feel like there's so much missed in like the modern psychedelic conversation where it's clearly this non-specific amplifier of good and bad.
Yeah.
And I believe in not stigmatizing it. I believe in it in the context of like desperate, PTSD-ridden veterans and stuff. And then simultaneous to both of those things, there are no shortcuts. And I don't really believe in like it in its most escapist form where it's like, I'm having issues. I need to go stamp it out with ayahuasca. Like, no, you got to go through the pain. Like,
even going beyond this, not just the psychedelics thing, but just looking for a protocol in general, right? It seems like, do you know what I mean? Like there's a way, there's something besides any sort of cheat code too. I don't mean to like reduce something by calling it a cheat code. And I think there is this, this program of living that has been in the conversation for thousands of years, right? That maybe we were too quick to walk away from.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And it's almost like some of the people that I feel like perform best in the cave, like are the most aware of how shitty the world is. And they just, make the changes necessary to like succeed in the, whatever operating system we're like living in.
Yeah. And if you make a commitment to, live a kind of contemplative life, or you're more worried about what's true, right?
Yeah.
Right? Do you know what I mean? And that's going to help you cut through your own BS in ways. And it's going to maybe remove a lot of the static in the background.
Yes.
So you can hear some things.
Yeah. Kind of increasing the signal to noise ratio, which that's a very hard thing to do. It's I guess like discernment. That's what that is.
Yeah.
And seeing low level things that you're encountering as simulacra of higher things, I think helps. And then there's sort of this Scylla and Charybdis where Carl Jung talks about this in his book on synchronicities, where it's like, if you put all faith in synchronicities, like at some point you're probably just going to like be in this solipsistic, like getting what you want from like your reality will just like full wholesale conform to your own beliefs. You'll think you're living in some hologram or whatever. Yeah. And then on the flip side, if you don't, impugn any sort of meaning, then there's that's like an issue, too. So it's like, there's this Scylla and Charybdis.
It's narcissism versus paranoia.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's clearly this like it's an art, it's not a science, it's this sort of aesthetic thing.
And so I guess my point is like when you ask about protocols, it's like the Greeks were not they didn't hide this, right? Here's what we're recommending to you, like live in a moderate way, right? Like value truth over other things, et cetera. And then that's like the path of insight.
Do you have anything to say? I won't ask this if you don't, but on the monolith as like a symbol, I thought of maybe asking that because like it's brought up in the Pasulka book. It's brought up in Girard actually in the Sacred and the Violence and the Sacred.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I don't have any sense of how to interpret it. Okay, but it does seem to be a symbol of like really humane importance. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It represents, like in 2001 Space Odyssey, you have the monolith, which is like, it's like, yeah, it inspires tech innovation. But then there's this idea, there's this like kind of hermeneutic reading of 2001 where it's actually a screen.
Yeah.
The 2000, you know.
The proportions all line up. Yeah.
The proportions all, it's actually like the cinematic, like the movie age is the monolith. And so the monolith is somehow the noble mythology of the future. And that's the Pasulka's book starts out about how like media shapes our understanding of what we see.
Yes.
And maybe even literally like Jacques Vallée talks about, you know, maybe these aren't space aliens, but if we start to believe that enough, you know, they'll appear like this sort of egregore model of consensus reality where reality is actually just a consensus collapsing function. It's not this sort of objective.
I mean, I think we can, not in a magical way, but we can pretend things into existence. Do you?
I agree.
Yeah. So like, you know, you walk in the room and say, "Hey, Jim, how are you doing today?" And I'm going to say, "I'm doing fine," whether I feel fine or not.
Yep.
Right? It's like that. Some contemporary psychoanalytic thinkers, you know, talk about like we're always performing for this big other. That's in the room. But big other is something we've pretended into existence.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But now it's here. And like to act like I wouldn't feel a little weird if you didn't say, "I'm doing fine, Jim." When I ask how you're doing, I'd be lying. So big other's here, even though we know it's just something we pretend into existence.
Totally.
So it seems like we can pretend things into existence that then have a downward effect on us, right? Not unlike our technologies.
If I have some fake smile I put on for the next 3 hours, I think statistically, like I'm going to be like a little happier or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and then you're like, okay, if that's true, science is actually like the most political because science is sort of the modern mythology of today. It's the thing we hold most sacred.
Yeah.
It involves the founding myth, you know, the Big Bang. It involves rituals, you know, people with lab coats or whatever, and these sort of priestly citadel or whatever.
Remember the honest placebos? Those symbols of science work. Yeah.
They really work.
And that's something we've pretended into existence.
Do you think we see a shift into kind of, you know, there's talks of a re-enchantment and, you know, this is from the Max Weber's German sociologist, the age of disenchantment, which we seem to, I think, be coming out of, like Richard Dawkins and all these guys like who are like, you know, hardcore, like atheist materialists. That does seem to be kind of ending. And you have Christians like Rod Dreher writing about this, and like you have a lot of people talking about this sort of re-enchant. I mean, I did not expect in starting this channel. I started it actually. It wasn't even originally about UFOs, and then I started to cover UFOs. I didn't think it would get this big on the UFO thing, but people are so fascinated by it.
So, I mean, I think you're right. There is. I mean, this is bad armchair sociology, right? Like, I think you're right. There's an openness that wasn't there, you know, say in like the early 2000s, like when the big trend then was, you know, the new atheists and all that, right? Okay. So I think there's gonna be a difference between the Gen Zers from the millennials there. You know what I mean? You know, right? Cause like the millennials kind of were coming online in the middle of the Richard Dawkins craze. And now like the Gen Zers are coming online in the middle of this, right? So I do agree with you. And I think there's a healthy openness to enchantment. But I also worry, though, too, that it could become an unhealthy openness to mystification, too. You know what I mean? Where like just any enchantment's going to do now.
Anything goes.
Anything goes, yeah. Or even an openness to maybe the most unhealthy versions of religion and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, so I worry that like, you know, the much abused pendulum swing metaphor, right? But I do worry that the swing could go to the irrational. Right. Too. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I do as well.
Yeah. And like, and like, look, you can see in the UFO world, like some people will go for anything pro UFO, right?
Oh yeah. And they get super defensive where they're like, this is real. UFOs are real.
Yeah.
Like go on the sort of press circuit thing, and that's all they want. It's more of like a political campaign.
Yeah.
And it's not this sort of egoless search for truth. It's
so I do worry, you know, that our recovery from materialism could slip into a kind of anti-enlightenment irrationalism too.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, definitely could. What do you think if Plato were here today and he saw the UFO thing, the AI thing, like he saw this sort of like these really intense movements that involve secret technology, they involve, kind of asymmetric tail risk. But they also involve the saving of humanity. What do you think he would say?
I think he would mistrust the whole deal.
I love it.
I think he would.
That's
I think he'd
awesome.
say, "Hey, welcome to your cave, man."
Yeah.
I think he'd mistrust it.
He would say, because the thing, it's probably like a lot of these things point charismatically at the truth, but they're all being used politically. They're all sort of political footballs or whatever. So it's like,
and I think so. I read the Republic as this is a manual for political skepticism.
Right. I love that.
And I think he would look at all this and say, we've seen this movie before, guys.
Yeah. Well, there are very few people, I think, who truly search for truth in a sort of trans-political way, where it's like it transcends self-gain or, desire for, dominion over others of the world or whatever. And I think that's like that's the least commoditized thing in the world.
It's probably the one thing you can't commodify.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
You can't do it. And it's tough because it's not rewarded, in this world. We were talking earlier, before getting here, and you were like asking me about like the show, and I was like, I don't know, man, like existential crisis, like, the more it becomes this economically self-sustaining thing or whatever, it's sort of impossible to unbound it from that. And then all of a sudden that like leaks into like just the pure truth seeking.
Right.
And it's a standard that no podcast ever holds itself to or whatever, where it's like it's just intellectual entertainment circuit or whatever. But somehow on the UFO topic, I want to hold myself to this standard. And I think we should be held to this standard where if you're not providing incremental evidence every single show or whatever, you're kind of not really, you're just like, you're talking to these talking heads and they're just saying the same shit and they're inserting themselves into the conversation. The whole thing's kind of lame. I'm sort of actively trying to think like, how do you do what I'm trying to do in a capitalist world and context or whatever. I don't know. I don't really know.
Prior to the revolution, right? How do you do this?
Yeah.
So, I mean, okay. So for me, this is going to sound maybe paradoxical. I trust myself because I have changed my mind on very big ticket stuff.
Yep.
At certain points in my life. Okay. And now you might think, no, that would mean you mistrust yourself because you've been wrong before. What makes you think you're right this time? But it makes me trust myself more because it's like, well, I think I could admit to myself that I was wrong.
Exactly.
In ways that might even be embarrassing to me.
Totally.
In certain circles. Do you see that? Yeah.
Yes.
And so I think, you can trust, let's remember there's a cave, so you really can't trust anything on a screen, right? Okay. But like implicitly, right? But like, I think you can trust the people more the degree to which they have actually changed their mind.
I agree.
And have admitted it publicly and said, I was wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean? And I think as long as you're truly open to changing your mind, right? And of course, and you will know that, right? Like in your, as you lie awake at night worrying, right?
Yeah.
Only you'll know that is, could I change my mind? And have I changed my mind? Yeah. I think I think that maintaining that openness to being like utterly debased by the truth. I think that's the most important intellectual virtue.
Well, I think it's not only important to do in a proxy for how intellectually honest somebody is, but it's probably any search for like big T truth sort of ends up in that. It's like the bridge over the River Kwai or whatever, where you spend your whole time trying to build this bridge and then you realize, or it's like The Alchemist, you realize it was within, or, it's this sort of, you've been extremely ignorant of like these core truths, because all truth seeking, everything in life is leveraged by somebody's internal psychology. Everything
100%.
And it's all, so it's like the UFO thing is it's often very escapist. It's often the people are interested in sort of left-hand path kind of occult stuff, and it's like, it's not it's not always like great, like the impetus for behind a lot of these things. And so I think the earnest inquiry into this stuff is, if that's, you know, part of your path, is fine. And then there's some sort of coming to terms with, you know, often it's like the, you know, St. Francis of Assisi, where it's like this forcing function towards good.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating.
So,
yeah.
I think one of the most profound moments in philosophy is the very first line of the preface of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, where he says, "We knowers are least well known to ourselves." Okay. And it's direct kind of, you know, FU to Socrates, you know, the know thyself, right? You know, the unexamined life is not worth living, to say, well, have you really inquired? Like, have you really looked into your own, like, irrational biases,
right?
Like your own needs that might be fulfilled by all this, right? Do you know what I mean? And I think, and especially something like with the UFOs, I think you really need to be open to how my own unconscious could be gaming this for me.
100%. It's the Jung line, like, you know, you call it fate until you reconcile with your subconscious or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah,
you know,
it's a good line. Yeah.
And it's, it pre-leverages everything. And if you don't admit that, it's definitely doing it to you. If you do admit that, then maybe it loses a little bit of power and you have some sort of objectivity around it. But I do find that as the dirty little secret in all of ufology is, like, everybody, and I mean everybody, has some sort of autobiographical thing in their past or reason for being into it. And the ones that I find often the most honest actors, and certain people maybe can't talk about these things publicly because they do come from, you know, specific positions.
Yeah.
But everybody's got a little bit of that.
And it's probably true of our political views, our religious views, et cetera, et cetera.
Everything.
And that doesn't mean these things need to be abandoned, but it does mean we have to, like, be aware of where our cognitive weak spots are.
Totally.
And make sure we're not being exploited.
Yeah, I flipped from being pretty diehard liberal growing up, and I still am, I guess, anti neoconservatism or whatever. So that was, you know, where I think the macro shifted. What's that?
Bomb fewer people.
The what?
Bomb fewer people.
Yeah, bomb fewer people. I was always, you know, I'm still consistent on that. Yeah, exactly. And so maybe there's some sort of like neoconservative, neoliberal alliance or something, and I'm sort of anti that or whatever. But, like, I also shifted. I've also become, like, a little more right wing, and you know, I often trust people who have had shifts like that because I'm like, oh, you're willing to, like, just kind of throw out your own ego, question yourself.
Because you probably had to eat a lot of crow with some friends. When you,
I still do. I have friends who, like, went to, you know, college with me, and they're like, what's wrong with you, dude? Like, I'm like, I'm sorry. Yeah. And you look, I have to eat a lot of crow on the right wing is a lot of crow. You know, there's like, there are issues on both sides.
I can't remember if he's still alive or not, but it was a very important contemporary philosopher named Hilary Putnam. And Putnam was famous for changing his mind.
Yeah.
And at one point, I believe there was an interview or something with him where he said, look, I thought the point was to be right, not to be consistent.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
And it should, like, I think the best way to get to truth is this dialectical thing.
Yes.
Where you play with falsity. You're like, you don't know, like, but you assume a belief that you think is kind of too radical or beyond the pale or ridiculous. And in many cases, like the Pasulka thing or the Carl Jung thing, you're like, actually, I think there's something real here.
Yes.
And then in other cases, you play with it and you're like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Like, I'm going to discard that. But a priori concealing yourself from quote unquote misinformation as deemed by some authority figure is grounds for, like, horrible critical thinking and being manipulated.
Yeah. Hegel, like, he's really dismissive of the fear of being wrong. Yeah. And he thinks there's kind of a risk. Like, there's like, we have to be willing to, like, go on what he calls the highway of despair to get anywhere. Like to constantly have our views, like, wrecked.
Yes.
Right. To make any progress.
I love that.
Yeah.
Do you think some of these philosophers, I always go back and forth, this is me being pre-leveraged by my own biases here. So I'll admit, and the whole show is, but, like,
that is your show, though.
Yeah, it is. Totally. Yeah. You can't get around that.
You don't like it, get your own show.
Yeah, exactly. But, like, Hegel, I think of, you know, I think there's a book called, like, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition.
Yeah.
And he was, like, friends with, like, Jacob Bohm or like, you know, sort of contemporaries, and, like, you read Bohm stuff, you read, like, you know, the Aurora and stuff, and it's like these just, like, really trippy, interesting stuff, and you hear, like, rumors he might have been, like, a Rosicrucian and, like, part of, you know, secret societies and stuff. How much do you think some of these philosophers, like maybe Hegel being a good example, dabbled in like the, more esoteric?
Look, I think they all had private lives.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And if you found out that some prominent, philosopher I have no one in mind here. Okay. Some prominent philosopher at prestigious University Z, let's say, right. Today, was like a 33-degree Mason or something like that. That wouldn't be entirely surprising to you.
No,
that sort of
totally.
thing. So I don't doubt that you could find, and it's certainly like those sorts of groups are all over, the Enlightenment and things like that.
Yeah.
So I would not be surprised if like Hegel had some dabblings of that sort. Yeah.
And it's fascinating. You have Jacques Vallée's, calling his working group on UFOlogy, studying UFOs with Jalin Hynek and a bunch of these guys in the 70s, The Invisible College. He even named his book The Invisible College, which is homage to, Robert Boyle. But originally
these are subtle hint, right?
Yeah, less than subtle hint. And these are originally Rosicrucian ideas.
Now with so using Hegel as an example, right? And so maybe he was involved in some esoteric stuff, or and he had it was in the hermetic stuff, right? I don't know if that need change how we read the texts, though.
Sure.
Do you see? I'm happy to take his public presentation of the text at face value, right? Even though there may be significant things to learn of other things that he might have been up to.
Yeah. I never know how to read, some of these people. It's like, are they really into it, or is it some sort of like tactic or something? I
mean, he's also like on paper a Lutheran too, but that would not really like. There's some pretty. He comes apart with that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's all so fascinating. I mean, talk about a philosopher who's had just an outsized impact on modernity.
Yeah.
And Hegel has to be, at the top.
Definitely.
But this has been an honor. I really appreciate it.
I've had a good time,
Jim.
man.
Yeah, this is a blast.
Yeah.
And I'd love to do it again. Is there anything else we've missed or anything?
No, not I'm aware of. Yeah. So
okay.
Feel free to drag me back down. I would love to do it.
I would love to do it, man. Maybe I'll come out to you. I'd love to see Kansas and hang out. And
come during tornado season and we'll
Yeah. Yeah, why not? Yeah, man, this is a blast. Go out and buy a unidentified flying hyper object. You working on anything else, or do you want to promote anything else? Twitter or anything? Or
yeah, I have a mostly dormant Twitter account. So
okay.
Yeah. So I have a Substack. Maybe check that out.
Okay, awesome.
But if you're interested, have a look at the book.
Cool. And is it on Substack? It's just Jim Madden, or
it's hard to change your Substack name, right? I like accidentally made it. I think it's just literally Jim Madden's newsletter.
Okay.
So
it's like, why not? Literal. Yeah, People know what they're getting.
And I do have a webpage, jdmadden.com.
Okay.
It has a bunch of papers and podcasts and stuff. So
okay, awesome. Well, really appreciate it. This is a blast.
You bet. Thank you.
Yeah.